For some while now, I've been incredibly fascinated with the concept of the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's legendarium, prior to Peter Jackson's films dominating our perception of his work at large. I was made aware of Tolkien's mythos via the Jackson films, which I viewed and really loved when I was still a primary school student, or researching his world via the internet, the one wiki to rule them all, plus reading The Hobbit via it being prescribed to us in Year 6. I came to feel even more fascinated with the source for seemingly limitless imagination of the ethereal texts, rather than the more attempted grounded earthiness of the Jackson trilogy. I still hold an enormous fondness for Jackson's trilogy and most of his films in general, although I do envy those who knew of these works as images in their imaginations, inspired at most by some illustrations in the dust jacket, in a companion hardcover guide to, or maybe that Bakshi film from the late 70s. I'll never be able to experience what that was like, although one of the most potent ways I have been able to gauge this feeling is via viewing two television documentaries made on the subject of Tolkien, which aired in the mid to late 1990s, likely commissioned in anticipation of the long-awaited film trilogy. First we have the 1996 production J.R.R.T, a film portrait of J.R.R. Tolkien, directed by one Derek Bailey, which you can view on YouTube thankfully, which is most likely the superior of the two documentaries due to its longer runtime. The latter runs at 47 or so minutes. Fascinating emphasis on the number of Americans who became enchanted with Tolkien at a time when British culture or media was ignored or scoffed at by the self-important Americans. Indeed, Tolkien was the last British author the Americans seemed taken with until J.K. Rowling. Maybe some of the only art from England in the post-war period to be appreciated by so many Americans that wasn't a pop or rock music act. The most fascinating thing about Tolkien's mythology for me, or perhaps this is an amalgamation of several different qualities, is the convicted consistency of his imaginary realm, a dense history some decades in the making prior to the penning of even The Hobbit. By the time The Lord of the Rings was being written, Tolkien was responsible for a text that was potentially writing itself via the enormous mythology he had already composed if intention for publication, though unfinished, some time before The Hobbit's publication. We knew this work, this mythology, later as the Silmarillion, known for being the backstory to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the creation myth and the major moments in history leading up to the Third Age, as it is referred, where the Silmarillion was initially the core text being devised by the author, and so it is vitally important to understand, at least for Lord of the Rings, as being a perhaps simplified conclusion to events which he had been considering for his Silmarillion mythos for some many years prior. I guess the moral of the story is when embarking on your own Tolkien-inspired fantasy epic, if you want it to be as good or as interesting or impactful as Tolkien's work, you must research, consider, imagine, construct, and envisage an entire coherent history for multiple decades, before even penning a little novel which wrote itself on after the author scribed in a hole in the ground they lived a hobbit. If you are willing or able to do as much work as Tolkien on his own imaginary world, and it is essentially or almost impossible to, then you will have matched Tolkien. And if you try to, you won't finish it, because the show comes out before and you cash in on it, or rather it just gets too big and unlike Tolkien you have no ending in mind and garden the story until it grows way out of control into some so-called Myronese knot. But we'll always have Tolkien in the Rings, just not a truly worthwhile American competitor/contemporary counterpart. Next time, research everything for years, publish them all, in a few less, rather than spending years trying to write them all.